I'm Adele Ryono, a high school senior, a CoGen Voices Fellow, and the founder of reGenerations, which is a nonprofit that empowers youth to have conversations with the people in their lives, the elders in their lives, and record stories. Going way back to the beginning, though, I was basically raised by my grandparents. Not officially, but they were such a consistent presence in my childhood that I don't think there's any other way to describe it. When I was little, it was trips to the bakeries and learning to read and driving to piano lessons. And then I got older and we started talking about our world, its problems, and what I wanted to change. And that relationship is the reason why reGenerations exists, to create a way for other young people to preserve the stories and the values we learn from the elders in our lives. And it's also why this conversation about grandfamilies feels so important to me. At its center, it's really a book about making sure the people who hold our families together aren't overlooked any longer. I have to start off by saying that I read Grandfamilies in one afternoon, and I think my experience reading it is pretty common. I'd known, of course, that grandfamilies exist, but I don't think I'd ever really consciously thought about them. A lot of what I was reading felt familiar about the love and the support within these families and the values that get passed down, but there are also so many challenges and policy needs and dynamics I never considered, and so this book really opened my eyes. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce you all to Donna Butts. She was the executive director of Generations United for nearly 30 years, and she's spent her whole career working to convince the world that we need more opportunities for generations to work together. Grandfamilies is another example in her long history of pushing that conversation forward. So, Donna, our first question for you today is just please tell us a little bit more about why you wrote this book.
Well, thank you, Adele, and thanks to my friends and colleagues at CoGenerate for making this conversation possible. I loved the insights that you shared about the book and about your life when we started. So thank you very much for taking the time to join me in conversation today. I wrote the book really for three reasons. I was fortunate enough to lead Generations United for almost 30 years and work with some incredible people on staff, but also some incredible people around the country who were in intergenerational programs and in grand families. And so what I wanted to do was was tie a bow on that first 30 years of work because there's still a lot more work to go forward. I wanted to honor the families and elevate their stories and their strengths and their resilience and their hopes. I wanted to capture the progress that had been made over 30 years and try to encourage people because sometimes it feels like we're going backwards, that we're not making progress. And and some of this change takes time. So not to give up, but to keep fighting the good fight. And then also for people who weren't aware of the families to care about them, to want to do something about them. And if that's only to respect and value the contributions that they make.
Thank you. Moving on, I think that something I really loved about grandfamilies is how you wove in all of these stories from real families. And in a lot of them, the grands and the youth go on to become advocates for other people facing those same issues. I wondered if you could share a story of intergenerational solidarity from the book and tell us a little bit about how it shows us what intergenerational advocacy can look like in practice.
It's a really interesting question because when I think about intergenerational advocacy, I think about young and old advocating together. And there have been some incredible examples over the years, both in America and other countries, about the success of when you combine generations and that energy. And when I was thinking about the book and advocacy, what I wanted to do was really show the pillars of how you build a movement parts of that, even the term grandfamilies. I mean, Generations United worked with messaging experts 20 years ago to coin the term grandfamilies, which is now very much a part of our vocabulary and the terminology that people use. But the other thing that Generations United did was to realize the importance of people's voices and stories. And so there have been 5 grand rallies in Washington, D.C., and those are national events that bring grandparents, other relatives, and the grand successes, the children that they've raised or are raising, to Washington, D.C., to really show that power of people together and being able to talk to policymakers and have policymakers speak to them. And so when I was thinking about it, some of the grand successes, like Stacy Walker, Stacy and his sister went to live with their grandmother in Iowa City, Iowa, when he was about 3 or 4 and his mother was killed. She raised them both. She raised them in public housing. She raised them on a pretty small salary, but she always managed and had no problem asking for support for Stacy and his ambitions. And when I met him, he had just been named the Boys and Girls Club Youth of the Year. And he was just amazing. And he's continued to be an amazing person. And so he actually moderated or emceed one of the grand rallies. And he was such a motivation for the grands who were kind of in the throes of still raising their children to see see what the result of all of that effort could be. And so then to go up on the hill to have children and young adults who are being raised by grandparents or other relatives and grands together, it was a really powerful story. And each grand rally resulted in some sort of policy change and advancement, which I think is really tremendous, whether it was in the housing area, whether it was in authorities being required to try to find family members instead of immediately putting a child in foster care or in stranger care, whether it was kinship navigator programs, which have become the sort of 211 lines for grandparents who all of a sudden find themselves raising children. So I think that together, coming together, raising voices together across the age span and the caregiving span really made a difference.
Yeah, those grand rallies you talked about, they sound really incredible in that the sheer volume of people from like all over the country that were able to come together in one space behind this issue. That same idea of Grand Voices and the Grand Voices Network, I think it anchors this book in a way, and more broadly, those stories anchor the advocacy efforts that you're involved in to improve policy affecting grand families. I also know that Generations United is working on a Youth Voices expansion right now, and so it definitely feels like storytelling has become central to advocacy work on both sides of the age spectrum. So I wanted to ask what you've learned about the power of storytelling to change policy.
You're right, Adele. I really do believe in storytelling to change policy. And some folks who have been a part of this work for many years may remember somebody named Andy Goodman, who is an incredible communicator. And I'm gonna plug what he said, but it always stayed with me when he said, "Numbers numb, statistics stun, and nobody ever marched on Washington because of a pie chart." And it's just not, we can use those numbers. I mean, 2.5 million children are being raised by grandparents and other relatives. They saved our country more than $10.5 billion a year by keeping children out of the foster care system. And those are stunning statistics and important statistics. But it's when you tell a story and when you share a face and a real story, if it's done well, it touches the heart and the head, that it motivates people. And I know that for my motivation in the book, there's a through grandmother that is in the book. And her name is Adrian. She lives in a suburb of Chicago. And I'm thrilled because next month I'm going to be in Chicago with Mark Friedman and Adrian, and we're going to do a book event. Adrian inspired me because I heard her when she came to an event we did at the National Press Club. And she was a very shy, sort of white-haired grandmother. who said she only felt comfortable when she could sing in front of people in a choir. Never, it would never raise her voice otherwise. And here she was on a national stage, and she had no problem um, talking to policymakers, making her case because of her grandson, Joy, who she was raising. And Adrian went to court 127 times and spent over $100,000 to get custody of her grandson, Joy. And what she said is that she wouldn't have it any other way, that she'd talk to her friends and they would talk about the cruises they were going on, where they were going to play golf, what they were doing with their friends. And she said, I realized I cruised too. I cruised to the pediatricians, I cruised to the school, I cruised to after school events. Joy is my cruise. And she wouldn't have it any other way. And now, fast forward, Adrian is now 86, Joy's in his late 20s, and he prefers to be called Joe now. And I asked her one day how Joe was doing it. And she said, he's doing good. And I reminded her the cruise quote. And she said, well, Donna, we still cruise. It's just that now Joe drives me. So it's that caregiving across the lifespan, but it's also the stories and the visuals that you can create that really help people find the heart as well as the head.
That's actually a perfect bridge into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is how caregiving expands and evolves across the lifespan. In Grandfamilies, you write about how these networks often become sort of cyclical, where later in life, the children who were once cared for become the ones caring for their grands. How does that shifting dynamic speak to the importance of intergenerational caregiving and support systems across the lifespan?
There are two things that I'd like to say about this. One about grandfamilies, but also about what I always found fascinating. And Adele, to hear your story about how close you were to your grandparents. What I found in many years of working in the intergenerational field is that so oftentimes the people who are attracted to that field are people who had a close relationship with an older adult, whether it was a grandparent who was a part of raising them or raised them, a neighbor, a coach. It feels more natural and normal, and not something, and aging isn't something to fear. So I think that's really important in terms of just the connection between younger and older people and the need to make sure that people connect. But really with the grandfamilies and with caregiving, what I think about is the social compact. Some people talk about a social contract, which is, and when I think of contract, I think of a legal relationship of something you can't get out of. It's a legal relationship. But with a compact, it's that commitment between generations because we'll all both give and need support at some point in our lives. And so it's that commitment, that compact between each other that we will be there and we will care for each other that I think is so critical and something that we can't lose sight of. And that's really true when you have been a caregiver or had somebody who was taking care of you. So that in the case of Joey, as I was mentioning, and Adrian used to be the driver. Well, now Joe's driving her. They still live together because it works out to be a great situation for both of them. Adrian's now widowed and has lost her mother as well. So they have continued to be able to provide care. And oftentimes it's that child or niece or nephew that are the ones that are there to be the advocates as their caregivers age, just as the caregivers were there for them to be their advocates as they were aging too.
Yes, I love that phrasing of the social compact. I've never heard of that before, but I'm gonna start using that because it sounds so true. And yeah, it's because these relationships aren't something that like you legally write down on paper. They're something that's just formed out of like this love and I don't like relationships that form among families. So yeah, thank you for introducing that phrasing. And
I use it.
yes, and I am going to turn to some of the questions from our audience. So our first one is, what's the policy change that would make the biggest difference for grandfamilies right now?
You know, the unfortunate part about where we are right now is that a lot of what advocates are looking at is holding the line and making sure that there's not the clawback that we're starting to feel. Whether it's the supplemental food nutrition program, SNAP benefits, those really help so many grand families, and there are proposed cuts in that area. The temporary and child only grant under TANF is threatened. Housing supports. There are so many things that have been made as that there's been progress with that we need to make sure that we're holding the line on those. And then there is some grand families legislation that's recently been introduced that would continue to provide a national technical assistance center for states and counties and tribes working with grand families. And that technical assistance center that Generations United currently runs is essential to help the progress that we've seen in services and supports for grand families. So it's that continuum. It's again all of the things that we have been working for, holding the line. The kinship navigator programs were cut, and their funding was cut from 20 million to 10 million, and that's the money that goes to the states for those call centers or those navigators that can help grand families. So it's really I recommend anybody who cares about policy to sign up for Generations United's policy alerts because they'll then let you know this is when we need your voice to be lifted. This is when we need you to speak out.
Along a similar vein, what can people in the audience do in general to support grand families?
I appreciate that because I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll go to a documentary film and it'll get me so wound up about something, but then it won't help me know what I can do next about what I'm now wound up about. And what I wanted to do with the book was make sure I was hopeful that people were going to feel like they wanted to do something and that they had a new respect and understanding. So that at the end of the book, there's a whole piece on what people can do, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, the county level, the neighborhood level. And it's whether they want to do one thing, but like buy a backpack for a child, it's then part of a backpack drive that goes to grand families, or whether it's ongoing, they may want to help a grand family with their yard work. They may want to help a support group by taking care of the kids at the support group so the grandparents can, and relatives can talk with each other. Um, it could be, I was talking to somebody recently who had a therapeutic massage business, and I said, perfect, volunteer to go to a support group and give brands massages. There's so many things and individual things. And what I think was important is I was talking with one of the grands about this, and I had grands who reviewed the book and grands who looked over this whole idea about what people could do for grands. And one of them said, it's what happens is people always say, well, just let me know if I can do something. And she said, and then I call them and they're busy and they can't do it. So what she started doing is she has a list on her refrigerator. And when somebody says, what can I do to help you? She says, just look at the list and sign up. So she really nails them to do something. So I just encourage people with it, every little thing goes a long way. And and so please, you can do something to support the program in your area too. And then if you care about policy, let your voice be heard.
Yeah, that idea of just the little things mattering, I feel like that's something that I've definitely seen as I'm caring for my grandparents, as I'm watching my grandparents get older and figure out all of these things that come along with it. It's like sometimes it's not like huge policy changes that make a difference, but it can just be like your neighbor or like your friend reaching out and doing something. So I definitely appreciate that. Another question we have is what do you see the role of area agencies on aging being in this landscape?
The area agencies on aging are part of the aging services system in this country. There's a triple A in pretty much every county in country. And one of the programs that they administer is something called the National Family Caregiver Support Program. And back in about 2000, when that was first being discussed on Capitol Hill, it was designed to provide supports for more middle-aged people caring for older relatives. And Generations United successfully advocated that older adults are just as likely to be the givers of care as the recipients of care. And so grandparents were included. So states and counties can use a percentage of those dollars to support grandparents raising grandchildren. So I think that's a very important role that the AAAs play, is in how they administer that money, and then all the services that they do to provide older adults. I'd also love to see, one of the things that Generations United did was pull children and youth and aging advocates together, almost 30 years ago, to build a common agenda. And I'd love to see more of that at the state and county level, because oftentimes the AAA, because they're so busy too, we all are, that they're operating in a vacuum. And then I've got the child services that are operating in a vacuum. And if they would just get their heads and their resources together at times, they can really, I think, provide better supports for the families, the entire family.
And then we have a question from Yael. It says, how can we create more intergenerational housing options? It sounds like their family has done it by buying homes close together, but not everyone has that opportunity.
That's a great question. That's one of my passions, is intergenerational communities, intergenerational housing, and intergenerational living. It's not that you have to be under one roof like a grand family, but communities, neighborhoods, and we all individually are so much stronger when we're together. And so I believe deeply in the importance and increasing the amount of opportunity for intergenerational living. Um, there's Generations United worked with Harvard's Housing Center and Leading Age to create a blueprint for how to increase intergenerational housing opportunities. So I would really encourage the questioner and others to go to Generations United's website and look for the intergenerational housing blueprint, because that really has a lot. I think it's really comprehensive, has a lot of what can be done. And part of it, why I think it's so important, is because there's if you have resources, if you have money, you can buy houses together. You can revamp your home. You can buy a compound. But people who are more middle income, or are on a fixed income, or need affordable housing, their options are not as great. And so that's why I think we really need to do more with housing policy, to not segregate the ages, but to let them live together and care for each other and provide caregiving in your neighborhood area.
We definitely touched on storytelling already, but I wanted to go back to that for a second. I feel like one of the most powerful parts of the book was reading those first person accounts and seeing how that discussion of them was woven throughout your chapters. I was curious about what's gone into elevating those stories, and in particular, how youth and grands become these storytellers.
I'm doing as much as I can with the book and trying to get the book out there as widely as possible. And if anybody who's on the webinar has ideas about podcasts or media or where the story needs to go, please let me know, because that's what we're trying to do. So I think we're trying to elevate those stories. I think the Grand Voices Network that Generations United has, and works with and supports, is just really critical and a very good model for somebody who has something they're passionate about. Because what Generations United has been able to do is identify and work with and support the grand voices and support people to be able to tell their stories, because sometimes we get so caught up in our own passion and wanting to tell somebody everything. And in good storytelling, you can't tell everything, because people won't stay with you. You need to make it a story that people will listen to. So I think that's a part of it too, is to practice that story, and to be willing to share that, and also realize that part of storytelling, part of talking, is listening and being aware of your listeners.
And then a question from Deborah. She asks, are there practical resources those new to being a grand family can access?
Yes. The first thing that I would always suggest to somebody who finds themselves in this situation for the first time is to find your state fact sheet. Every state has a grand fact sheet, and it's on a website called, I think, Grand Fact Sheets, or you can get to it through Generations United's website or the National Technical Assistance Center website. And so it's looking at what your state fact sheet says because state laws vary. There's some federal laws, but state and local laws vary. But it also lists the support groups. It lists the resources that you can access. So that's always the first place. And then find your kinship navigator, whether it's a statewide navigator or a local navigator, and ask. And then I think the best advice that a grand gave me or told me that she lived by once was that when somebody tells you no, keep asking, ask and ask and ask and ask until you find a yes.
Then our very last question today that we'll close on is there anything writing this book changed your mind about or how you think about your work?
I think the most fun part or revelation for me is why did I ever think I could write a book? I thought I could do it in 6 weeks when I had a sabbatical. 3 years later, it was published, and so I think I just learned so much, and I'm still learning a lot as even now as the book is out and how you get a book out there. So I've learned a lot, and I think that's the part that I've loved is because I love to learn. Sometimes I feel like, oh my, how did I not know that? And how could I? But I love what I've been able to learn. It helped me to really come also to a point of where I see the commonality of the families, and where I see that commonalities is how they survive, and they survive on hope, humor, and hard work. They really hope for the best. They believe that the grandchild is going to succeed, but um, they need to laugh. And some of them are just hysterical. And the stories they tell, the way they approach life, humor helps you through. And then it's just hard work. So that's what I think about when I learn what I've learned about some of the things with grandparents.
Thank you, Donna, so much for that. I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation. And as we close, thank you everyone in our audience for listening. Before you log off, it would be great if you could answer this one question poll about if today's conversation might have inspired you to include more olders or youngers in your life. And also a reminder to pick up a copy of Grandfamilies wherever you buy your books. All of the proceeds go to support the work of Generations United. And Duncan will be putting the link to buy that in the chat, and you'll also get a link in the follow-up email. So thank you everyone again, and we hope that you learned something about grandfamilies.